There's a quiet understanding that settles in a man's bones after enough sunrises and sunsets. It whispers that no matter how wide your shoulders, how strong your back, or how clear your vision, you can only carry so much weight alone. You can only see so far. We all learn it, sooner or later, usually the hard way. The trick, the real grit of it all, isn't just knowing it, but living it, understanding that the greatest walls aren't built by a single hand, no matter how skilled. They're built by a steady, loyal line of hands, all pulling on the same rope, all pushing the same stone, refusing to let go when the ground gets soft beneath their feet. It's about sticking together when the world tries to rip you apart. That quiet understanding, it came to Vernon later than some, but it hit him hard enough to stick. Vernon, he was 48, a factory man through and through. 48 years etched into his face, not with deep wrinkles from laughter, but with fine lines of concentration, of measuring twice and cutting once, of steel dust and exhaust fumes. His hands, well, they told a story all their own. Knuckles thick and scarred, skin ingrained with grease that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. They were workers' hands, plain and simple hands that knew the rhythm of machinery, the vibration of tools, the weight of responsibility. His eyes, though, were the truest window. They were a steady, observant gray, often tired, but holding a deep current, a quiet kind of watchfulness that missed little. He wasn't one for idle chatter, Vernon. You'd see him at the Union Hall, leaning against a wall, just listening. To a new guy complaining about overtime, to an old-timer reminiscing about the glory days, to the rhythm of the jukebox. He'd nod sometimes, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, or just hold that steady gaze. Some folks might have called him gruff, distant even. They just didn't know the well that ran deep inside him. Inside, Vernon was pure bedrock, loyal as an old dog, protective as a mama bear when it came to his own. He carried a quiet hope for better days, not for himself, not really, but for the people he cared about, especially his family. That hope was a small, flickering flame, always guarded, always there. His biggest fear, failure. Not for him, no, he could take a punch. But the thought of failing Sarah, his wife, or Emily, their daughter away at college, or David, his boy still figuring things out in high school, that was a cold dread that could coil in his stomach like a snake. He lived in the same modest house his parents had lived in, a sturdy brick place in a neighborhood where the lawns were cut neat and the cars were mostly practical. It was well maintained, just like everything Vernon touched. His strength wasn't flashy. It was in his unwavering persistence, that stubborn, almost mule-headed loyalty to his word and his people. If Vernon told you he'd be there, he'd be there. If he saw something worth saving, someone worth believing in, he wouldn't give up. He had this knack, too, for seeing potential where others had long since written things off. But he had his weaknesses, same as anyone. Words didn't come easy to him, especially when it came to feelings. It was like trying to wrestle smoke. And that made him seem unapproachable sometimes, kept people at arm's length. He internalized everything, letting stress build up inside him like rust on forgotten metal, grinding at him slow and steady. He used to think that was the way to be, relying on only himself. Asking for help, investing too much in other people's dreams, it all felt like diluting his own efforts, like spreading himself too thin. He was a good worker, maybe one of the best on the line, but he walked that line mostly alone, often frustrated by others he saw as unreliable or just not as driven. He had his own race to run, and he figured he'd run it best by himself. The world for Vernon began not with a sunrise, but with the shriek of an alarm clock at 5 a.m., a sound as familiar and unwelcome as a chronic ache. His hand, calloused and thick-knuckled from decades of gripping tools, would slap the snooze button with practiced efficiency. Another 5 minutes stolen from the relentless march of the day, 5 minutes to lie there in the pre-dawn silence, the only sound the gentle, even breathing of Sarah beside him. He'd roll out of bed, the joints in his back protesting with a low groan, and move through his morning ritual like a well-oiled machine. Coffee, black and bitter, brewed strong enough to strip paint. A quick shower, the steam doing little to unknot the tension in his shoulders. Then out the door into the cold, still dark of the working-class street, the air often thick with the smell of exhaust and distant industry. He'd pass the other early risers, headlights cutting through the gloom, each man a silent comrade in the daily grind, headed to their own factories, their own lines. The plant was a cavern of steel and noise, the air thick with the metallic tang of molten iron and the acrid smell of cutting fluids. Vernon worked the press, a colossal beast that stamped out parts with a deafening crump thud day in and day out. His movements were precise, economical, honed over 25 years. He knew the machine better than he knew some of his family. He knew its groans, its subtle shifts, the way it hummed just before it needed a new die. 8, sometimes 10 hours a day, the rhythm of the press was the rhythm of his life, a relentless, repetitive beat that promised little change. Lunch was a thermos of coffee and a sandwich, eaten in the break room, the small talk as predictable as the shift change. Mostly sports, gripes about management, the weather. Vernon would listen, occasionally nod, offering a grunt or a short, direct observation. He was antisocial, not really. He just didn't see the point in wasting words. After all, the clock kept ticking and the line kept moving. Evenings brought a different kind of fatigue. The kind that settled deep in the bones, making it hard to relax, even with Sarah's easy laughter or the kids' chatter around the dinner table. Emily was away at college now, costs adding up like the layers of grime in the factory, and David, still in high school, was showing signs of wanting something more than the factory life. Good. Vernon wanted more for them too. But the weight of providing, of making ends meet, pressed down on him, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. The house was paid for, a relief, but the bills for everything else seemed to multiply overnight. The fridge made a rattling sound he couldn't ignore much longer. The car needed new tires. He'd sit at the kitchen table late at night, long after everyone else was asleep, staring at the numbers, trying to make the ends touch without snapping. Those quiet hours were when the other demons crept in, the ones he kept buried deep beneath the everyday exhaustion. He saw the world from behind the lens of a man who'd once dreamed bigger. There was a younger Vernon, a man with calloused hands but fire in his belly, who'd sketch out designs for things he wanted to build, not just stamp out. A small business, perhaps. Something he could point to and say, "I made that from scratch." He wanted to be a man who created, not just maintained. But the years had a way of grinding down ambition, turning fire into embers, then into cold ash. The risks had felt too great, the demands of a young family too pressing. So he'd chosen the steady path, the reliable paycheck, convinced that was the only responsible choice. Now that path felt less like a choice and more like a trap. He'd look at his hands, the same hands that could fix almost anything, and wonder what they could have built if he'd dared to use them differently. He'd watch David, full of a teenager's boundless energy and nascent dreams, and feel a pang of something close to fear. Fear that David might get stuck too, and deeper still, a raw, unspoken shame that he hadn't shown him another way. He preached self-reliance, told his kids to work hard, to stand on their own 2 feet, because that's what he believed. He'd built a fortress of independence around himself, brick by careful brick, convinced it was the strongest way to live. But sometimes, when the silence of the house was at its deepest, the walls of that fortress felt less like protection and more like a prison, high and unyielding, keeping him isolated not just from the world, but from the man he'd once hoped to be. He'd done everything right by his own measure. So why did it feel so wrong? Why did the hope for better days seem to shrink with each passing year, replaced by the quiet, resigned hum of the factory floor? The air in the factory, usually thick with the metallic tang of oil and the drone of machinery, had been heavier these past few weeks, thick with unspoken worry. It started with Mike. Mike, who worked 2 machines down from Vernon for 25 years, whose laugh could cut through the din of the shop floor like a cleaver. A man who'd seen Vernon through his own father's passing and the birth of his kids. Mike wasn't just a coworker. He was the closest thing Vernon had to a brother outside of his own blood. Then came the cough, a persistent hacking thing that turned Mike's face progressively paler, hollowed out the robust cheer in his eyes. He'd shrug it off, say it was just the dust, just a bug. But Vernon, with his quiet way of observing, saw the subtle shifts. Mike started coming in later, leaving earlier, leaning on his machine more often, his usual quick movements slowing to a drag. The news hit the factory like a dropped wrench, rattling everyone. Lung cancer. Aggressive. Mike was out indefinitely. Vernon felt the usual knot in his gut, the familiar unease when someone he knew got sick. He'd wished him well, of course, offered a quiet, "Let me know if you need anything," the standard line, knowing full well he probably wouldn't be called upon, and honestly wasn't sure what he'd do if he was. His way was to nod, offer silent support, and expect others to handle their own load. That's how he handled his. But this was different. Mike wasn't just dealing with a diagnosis. He was trying to keep his small, side hustle business afloat, a little woodworking shop he ran out of his garage, making custom cabinets and furniture. It was Mike's passion, his dream, the thing he hoped would let him escape the factory floor someday. He'd sunk his savings, his heart, everything into it. And with him laid up, the orders piled up, the calls went unanswered, the bills didn't stop. Vernon heard the whispers. Poor Mike. Shame about his business. A few guys from the shop offered to help at first, a day here, an hour there. But slowly, inevitably, the offers thinned. Life moved on. The urgent became old news. The easy empathy faded into polite regret. Vernon saw it unfold like a slow-motion car crash he couldn't quite look away from. He saw Mike's wife, Carol, her face etched with exhaustion and terror, trying to manage a demanding treatment schedule and keep the business from crumbling entirely. He saw Mike himself, thin and defeated in his hospital bed, his eyes holding a kind of despair that sucked the air out of the room. It wasn't just the physical pain. It was the pain of watching his life's work, his future, simply vanish, and the terrible loneliness of seeing the people he thought he could count on slowly, quietly slip away. Vernon found himself going to the hospital more often than he intended. Not to say much, just to sit. He'd bring coffee for Carol, maybe fix a leaky faucet at their house without really being asked. Each visit was a slow erosion of his old creed. He watched Mike not just dying but giving up. And he watched the community, not actively malicious but passively absent, their goodwill evaporating under the weight of sustained need. Vernon saw the stark, brutal reality of his own philosophy playing out. Everyone ultimately was alone. And in that raw, exposed moment, he realized just how terrifyingly unprepared he was for that truth, how truly isolated he had become in his fortress of independence. His own self-reliance, so carefully cultivated, suddenly felt less like a strength and more like a fragile, hollow shell. He felt an overwhelming pull, a strange, undeniable gravity telling him he couldn't look away this time. He couldn't just offer another platitude and retreat into his own life. Something had to give. That night Vernon lay in bed, the digital clock on the nightstand glowing 3:17 a.m. Sarah was a quiet, even presence beside him, her breathing slow and steady. The house was utterly silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. But Vernon's mind was anything but quiet. It was a cacophony of fear and accusation. He kept seeing Mike's eyes. Not the sickness, not the pain, but the defeat. The absolute soul-crushing despair of a man whose dreams had been snatched away, and then, crucially, whose support system had evaporated with them. Vernon had always prided himself on being tough, on not needing anyone. Man stands on his own 2 feet. He'd repeated it to himself, to his kids, a mantra. But what good was standing on your own 2 feet if the ground beneath you could just crumble, and there was no one left to even offer a hand up? He thought about his own life. The fortress he'd built. He'd preached independence, yet what had it gotten him? A quiet house, a steady job, bills paid on time. But also a gnawing emptiness, a sense of missed chances, a profound loneliness he'd never allowed himself to acknowledge. He'd avoided vulnerability, called it weakness. He'd kept everyone at arm's length, even Sarah, even his kids, in subtle, insidious ways, convinced that deep investment in anyone else's fate was a risk too great, a dilution of his own effort. He'd been so focused on not failing himself that he'd failed to truly connect. A cold dread seeped into his bones. What if that was him? What if something happened to him? Would his fortress protect him, or would it just be a lonely tomb? Would Emily and David, so full of their own nascent dreams, understand what it meant to truly lean on someone, or would they inherit his isolating philosophy? He told them to be strong, but he hadn't shown them how to be supported. He'd shown them how to earn, but not how to truly build with others. The shame was a bitter taste in his mouth. He feared failure for his loved ones, yet his own actions had implicitly taught them a path that led to isolation and vulnerability in the face of true crisis. He saw the gap now, not just between who he was and who he wanted to be, but between the life he was living and the life he should be living. He was a good worker, yes, dependable, reliable. But in the ways that truly mattered, in the ways of human connection and mutual strength, he was a pauper. All those years, all that striving, all that careful self-reliance, and for what? To be alone when the bottom fell out. The very thought was a physical punch to the gut. The hum of the refrigerator, usually a comfort, now sounded like the low thrum of his own trapped life, a monotonous, unyielding sound. The fortress had become a prison, and he, Vernon, the man who prided himself on never quitting, suddenly realized he had quit on the most important thing of all, the people in his life. Vernon sat there, the weight of that realization pressing down on him, heavier than any I-beam he'd ever lifted. He hadn't quit on a job, hadn't quit on Sarah or the kids, not in the everyday sense. But he'd quit on the invisible sinews, the unseen threads that truly bind a man to his world, to his community, to his people. He'd let them fray one by one through neglect and a misguided sense of self-reliance. He built a wall, brick by brick, not to keep trouble out, but to keep true connection at arm's length. A quiet, enough, formed in his mind, not a shout, not even a whisper, but a deep, steady thrum. Enough of this solitary battle. Enough of standing apart. Enough of believing that every struggle had to be shouldered alone, that asking for help was a sign of weakness, or worse, that offering it too deeply would somehow drain his own reserves. He didn't have a map. He didn't have a grand strategy. He just knew with an almost primal certainty that this path, the one he'd walked for so long, had to end. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark, knowing you had to move, but not yet seeing the ground below. All he knew was that the ground he was on was crumbling. The next morning came with its usual tyranny of the alarm clock, but something was different. The dull ache in his chest was still there, but beneath it, a tiny ember of resolve flickered. He showered, dressed, went through the motions, but his mind wasn't on the gears or the grind. It was on Mark. Mark, his friend, his almost brother. The one whose business had gone under, whose health was failing, whose spirit was being crushed under the weight of it all. Vernon had called, he'd offered money, a decent sum, more than he could easily spare, but Mark had refused it, with that look in his eyes that said, "It's not money I need, Vernon, it's something else." And Vernon, in his old way, had accepted the refusal and retreated, thinking he'd done his part. Not this time. He punched out at 3 p.m., the factory floor a blur of noise he barely registered. Instead of turning right toward home and the familiar comfort of his quiet house, he turned left. Mark lived on the other side of town, in a small house with a yard that used to be meticulously kept, now overgrown and tired-looking, just like Mark himself. Vernon felt the old familiar resistance rise up. What would he say? What would he do? He was a man of action, not words. The thought of knocking on that door, of having to face Mark's despair, maybe even his resentment for Vernon's earlier, distant attempts to help, it was almost too much. His stomach churned. It would be so easy to just keep driving, to tell himself he'd tried, that Mark needed his space. That Mark would call if he truly needed something. But then Mark's face flashed in his mind, pale and defeated. The image of the abandoned storefront, a symbol not just of a lost business, but of a lost dream. And the quiet resolve from his brutal 3 a.m. honesty came back, steady and unyielding. Enough. He pulled his old pickup to the curb, killed the engine. The silence was deafening, amplifying the thumping of his own heart. He looked at the house at the front door. It seemed miles away. He took a deep breath, the kind you take before lifting something impossibly heavy. He didn't know how to do this. He had no playbook for being there. All he had was the stubborn refusal to quit on someone he cared about, not just in theory, but in the raw, messy reality of it. He opened the truck door, the sound surprisingly loud in the quiet afternoon. One foot on the asphalt, then the other. He walked up the cracked concrete path, past the overgrown rose bushes that still stubbornly clutched a few fading blooms. His hand hovered over the doorbell, then lowered. He knocked, 3 solid, unhurried knocks. Silence, then a shuffling sound from inside. The door opened a crack, then wider. Mark stood there, looking thinner than Vernon remembered, his eyes shadowed, but with a flicker of surprise, maybe even a hint of something else in their depths. "Vernon," Mark said, his voice raspy. "What are you doing here?" Vernon shifted his weight, his hands feeling suddenly enormous and awkward at his sides. He hadn't planned his words, hadn't rehearsed. The gruffness was his default, but he looked into Mark's tired eyes and he pushed past it. "Heard you needed a hand," Vernon said, the words coming out rougher than he intended, but true. He gestured vaguely at the yard, then at the house, at the general state of things. "Or maybe just some company. I got a few hours before dinner. Anything needs doing." It wasn't elegant, it wasn't poetic, it was just Vernon, standing there. Not offering money, not offering advice, just offering himself. His time, his presence, his stubborn, newly minted resolve not to quit on his friend. And for the first time in a long time, Vernon felt a genuine lightness in his chest, like he'd finally dropped a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying. It was hard, yes, impossibly hard. But he had shown up. Mark didn't offer him a cup of coffee, didn't invite him in beyond the doorway. Just stood there watching, a specter of his former self. Vernon didn't expect a parade. He nodded towards the overgrown hedge. "Got my clippers in the truck. Looks like a good place to start." He returned to his truck, pulled out the heavy shears, the ones he usually used for his own sturdy bushes. The sun was dipping, casting long, distorted shadows across Mark's neglected lawn. He started clipping, the snip, 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 a steady rhythm against the quiet evening. Mark eventually retreated inside, leaving the door ajar. Vernon just kept working. He trimmed the hedge, then started on the knee-high weeds choking the flower beds. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with an almost automatic precision. He didn't think about it, just did it. An hour later, he knocked on the door again. Mark opened it, a half-eaten sandwich in his hand. He looked at the trimmed hedge, the cleared beds, then at Vernon, whose face was streaked with sweat and grime. "You didn't have to," Mark mumbled, but his eyes held something that wasn't quite despair anymore. Needed something to do, Vernon replied, the familiar gruffness masking the awkwardness he felt. See you tomorrow. And he left, the unsaid promise hanging in the air, a new kind of weight on his shoulders, but one he chose to carry. The next day, Vernon went to work at the factory, the roar of the machines a familiar comfort, a stark contrast to the quiet battles he was fighting elsewhere. But after his shift, instead of heading straight home, he drove to Mark's. It was harder this time. The brief flicker of something in Mark's eyes the night before felt like a mirage in the harsh light of afternoon. Mark was sitting on his porch, staring blankly at the street. Got a wrench? Vernon asked, gesturing at the broken mailbox post leaning precariously by the curb. Mark just pointed vaguely inside. Vernon found the wrench, found some spare bolts in his own toolbox. He spent an hour shoring up the post, making it sturdy again. Mark watched, silent. Vernon felt the old pull, the familiar urge to just retreat, to go home to Sarah and the kids, to the easy comfort of his own four walls. What was he doing here? Mark wasn't talking, wasn't engaging. It felt like shouting into a well. But he remembered the desolation in Mark's eyes that first day, the community's swift abandonment. He remembered his own dark night, the raw truth of his isolation. He hadn't quit on himself then, and he wouldn't quit on Mark now. Not yet. Day 3, day 7, day 14. The rhythm settled into a grueling pattern. Vernon would work his shift, then drive to Mark's house. He cleaned out the gutters, repaired a loose shingle, tackled the overflowing garage where the remnants of Mark's small delivery business sat, gathering dust and regret. Each task was physically demanding, but the true battle was internal. His own mind was a battlefield of doubts. He's not getting better, Vern, a quiet voice inside him would whisper. You're just wasting your time. He needs a doctor, not a handyman. Sarah, bless her heart, tried to be understanding, but her questions were sharper now. You're home so late, Vern. You look exhausted. Are you sure this is doing any good? He just grunted, not having the words to explain the raw, illogical pull that kept him showing up. How could he tell her that by showing up for Mark, he was also showing up for a part of himself he hadn't known was lost? There were days he almost didn't go. Days when the exhaustion was a physical ache, when the thought of facing Mark's silence, his profound sorrow, felt like more than he could bear. One particular evening, after a back-breaking day at the factory and another 2 hours spent wrestling with a perpetually leaky faucet in Mark's bathroom, Vernon drove home in a haze of frustration. The faucet still dripped. Mark had just sat on the edge of the tub, watching, not offering help, not even a comment. This is pointless. Vernon muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel. He doesn't care. I don't know what I'm doing. He felt a cold dread, a familiar knot of loneliness tightening in his gut. The old Vernon, the man who built his walls high and relied only on himself, screamed at him to cut his losses, to retreat, to save himself the heartache. He almost convinced himself. He imagined driving past Mark's house tomorrow, just going straight home, letting the old patterns reassert themselves. The thought was strangely comforting, a release from the Sisyphean task. But as he pulled into his own driveway, the image of Mark's face, not the blank stare, but that first surprised flicker of recognition, came unbidden to his mind. And then another image. His own face in the mirror that dark night, the raw fear of being utterly alone. He wouldn't quit, not on Mark. And maybe, more importantly, not on the man he was trying to become. He still didn't know if it would make a difference for Mark, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it was making a difference for him. He was tired, yes, but underneath the weariness, there was a quiet, stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. He was learning in the slow, grinding rhythm of unrewarded effort that sometimes showing up was the only thing that mattered. Day 21 arrived like any other, the 5 a.m. alarm screaming its usual defiance. Vernon's body still ached, but something in his gait felt different as he moved through the pre-dawn quiet of his home. He still went to Mark's, still found Mark mostly quiet, sometimes sitting, sometimes just staring. But on that 21st morning, as Vernon finally managed to stop the leaky faucet in Mark's kitchen, Mark cleared his throat. "Coffee," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't offer to make it, but it wasn't a question either. It was a statement, a small, cracked window into the world he'd been hiding from. Vernon, without a word, brewed a pot. He sat opposite Mark for the first time in silence that wasn't strained but simply existed. The next week brought more small shifts. Mark would occasionally grunt a response or even point to a tool Vernon needed. One afternoon, when Vernon was patching a hole in the roof, Mark actually came out and handed him a nail gun. A genuine, if fleeting, flicker of focus in his eyes. Sarah noticed it first. "You're different, Vernon." she said one evening, watching him from the kitchen doorway as he organized a toolbox he hadn't touched in years. Less heavy. He just grunted, a familiar sound, but his eyes, when he met hers, held a softness she hadn't seen since their earliest days. He hadn't realized how much of his own inner burden had lifted as he'd focused on easing Mark's. He was still the quiet man, still observed more than he spoke, but the distance in his eyes had begun to recede, replaced by a steady, unwavering light. His coworkers, too, started commenting. "Vernon, you got a spring in your step, old man." He'd just offer a wry smile, but inside, a seed of genuine hope had finally taken root. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was building something, brick by painful brick, and the foundation felt solid. Weeks stretched into a month, then two. Vernon was still showing up at Mark's, but now Mark was often waiting for him, not just passively, but with an idea, a task they could tackle. Slowly, painstakingly, Mark's house began to look like a home again. The yard, once wild, was tamed. The broken window panes replaced. But more importantly, the man inside them was starting to mend. He wasn't the Mark of old, not yet, but he was present. He was working. He was talking. Vernon, having spent so long showing up for Mark, found himself showing up for others too. He'd helped a new guy at the plant figure out a complex machine when everyone else just grumbled about him being slow. He offered an old widow down the street a hand with her gutters after a storm. He wasn't doing it for accolades. He was doing it because he saw a need, and he knew now, deep in his bones, what it felt like to be abandoned and what it meant to be held. His stubborn loyalty, once a solitary burden, had become a magnet. When Mark needed help moving some equipment from his old, defunct business storage, Vernon didn't just ask David. He called old buddies from the factory, guys he'd only ever shared a beer with on Fridays. And they showed up. Not just for Vernon, but because Vernon had shown up for them in countless small, unremarked ways over the years. That day, lifting heavy boxes, they talked, they laughed. Mark, for the first time, cracked a joke. It was rusty, but it was there. That afternoon, sharing lukewarm beers in Mark's newly cleaned garage, an idea sparked. Mark had always been good with engines, and a few of the guys present were handy with their tools. One mentioned how hard it was to find good, honest auto repair in their part of town. Another talked about a struggling neighbor whose car was constantly breaking down. Vernon, the quiet observer, listened. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. "We could fix that," he said, nodding towards a sputtering lawnmower Mark had just resurrected from a pile of junk. "We could fix a lot of things." It wasn't an official business, not at first. It was just a few guys working out of Mark's garage, fixing small engines, then cars, then anything that needed a wrench and a steady hand. Vernon wasn't the boss, he was the bedrock. He didn't shout orders, he just showed up every single time with his quiet focus and his unwavering belief in what they could accomplish together. He'd bring coffee, he'd find parts, he'd listen when someone hit a snag. His simple, persistent presence fostered a trust that grew stronger than any contract. They helped others get back on their feet, fixing a delivery van for a struggling bakery or patching up a roof for a single mom. Word spread. People started coming to Vernon's guys, not just for repairs, but for advice, for a sense of community. Mark slowly, tentatively began to reclaim his old life, not alone, but surrounded by a small, formidable network. It wasn't an empire of gold, but an empire of good, built on the solid bedrock of mutual support and shared grit. Vernon, the man who once thought he had to go it alone, had built something far grander than any solitary achievement. He built a web of connections so strong it could lift up entire lives. He sat on his porch swing one evening, watching the streetlights flicker on. Emily was home from college, chatting animatedly with David about his new project. Sarah was humming in the kitchen. He thought about Mark, who was now volunteering at the local community center, sharing his newfound resilience. "Funny thing," he murmured to Sarah when she joined him on the swing. "I used to think being strong meant you didn't need anybody, just you, your two hands, and your own stubborn will." He paused, listening to the crickets. "Turns out," he said, a faint smile touching his lips, "the real strength ain't in carrying all the weight, but in finding folks who'll carry it with you and showing up for them no matter what. Because some things, some people, they're worth the fight. You just gotta stick by them, especially when it's hard. And once you find that trust, once you build that bridge, ain't no mountain you can't move."